Well, with those words, I'm going to say good evening and welcome to each of you. Shalom, bruchim habayim lekolchem. Tonight's special panel discussion is on rabbis and the future of Judaism. Our goal tonight is to talk about what a conservative Masorti synagogue should expect from modern clergy leaders, and vice versa, what rabbis should expect from synagogues and synagogue members. My name is Victor Rabinovich. I'm the president of Kehillat Beth Israel here in Ottawa, Canada. Our shul is a solid, mid-sized congregation with over 500 households, and we are just in the middle of a rabbi search and recruitment process. Our current rabbi in residence is Baruch Frydman-Kohl, and a future rabbi in residence is Adina Lewittes, who's part of this panel. And the chair of our adult education committee, David Reutenberg, with Rav Baruch, have put together tonight's discussion. We want our members and other congregations to think about what we should expect from today's pulpit rabbis and what they should expect from us. Now, Rav Baruch is going to be the moderator tonight. And before turning this over to him, I want to stress one housekeeping matter. All people attending this Zoom event are viewers. We are going to invite you to participate by posing questions for the panel. Please use the Q&A icon on your screen. That's right at the bottom of the Zoom screen. And please use that. You may have to be in full screen mode to see it. And when you do, you can click on the Q&A and you can press it at any time and then type in your question. And Rabbi Baruch Frydman-Kohl is going to try to direct your question to the panel members or to an appropriate panel member. So with that little piece of housekeeping, I'm going to turn this over now to Rav Baruch, and you won't see me again. Good discussion.
Thank you, Victor. Welcome to all of you. This is a time of memory, grief, and resilience. Today has been the 40th anniversary of the 1983 bombing of the U.S. Marine Corps barracks in Beirut, Lebanon, that killed 241 military personnel in the single deadliest day for U.S. Marine Corps since the Battle of Iwo Jima in the Second World War. And minutes after that first bombing, a second suicide bomber killed 58 French paratroopers and 6 Lebanese civilians. Friday will be the 5th anniversary of the Tree of Life, or L'Simcha shootings in Pittsburgh, an anti-Semitic attack that killed 11 people and wounded 6, and was the deadliest assault on Jews in the history of the United States. We felt it was very important to continue our planned program for tonight and activities, despite the war going on between Israel and Hamas. Keeping in mind that larger picture, we want to begin with a prayer for the state of Israel, which includes our hopes and prayers as well for the Chayalim and Chayalot, the soldiers of the Israel Defense Forces, as well as a prayer for those who have been taken captive by Hamas. Call upon Cantor Jason Green to lead those tefillot.
Thank you, dear friends. In these dark times for Israel, there is light, there is hope, there's righteousness, and there are successes. We continue to pray that God strengthens the hand of those who defend our holy land, that God delivers them and crowns their efforts with triumph, that God will bless the land with peace and its inhabitants with lasting joy. Avinu, Avinu, Sheba Shamayim, Zu Yisrael Goalo. מדינת ישראל, ראשית צמיחת גאולתנו, הגן עליה בעברת חסדך, ופרוס עליה סוכת שלומך, ושלח אורך ועמיתך לראשיה שריה ויועציה ותקני בעצה טובה מלפניך, ותקני בעצה טובה מלפניך. אבינו אבינו שבשמיים, צור ישראל וגואלו. אבינו אבינו שבשמיים, צור ישראל וגואלו. צור ישראל וגואלו. ונאמר
Prayer for captives.
Please join me at home. Achenu kol Beit Yisrael, Achenu kol Beit Yisrael, hanetunim betzara, בצרה ובשביה, העומדים בין בים ובין ביבשה. המקום ירחם, ירחם עליהם, ויוציאם מצרה לרווחה, ומייפל לאורה, ומשעובד לי גאולה השתה, בעגלה ובזמן קריב. אחינו כל בית ישראל, אחינו כל בית ישראל, הנתונים בצרה, בצרה ובשביה, העומדים בין בים ובין ביבשה.
Amen. I want to thank our panelists for agreeing to participate in this Zoom program on the future of rabbis and congregations, particularly for Masorti congregations, but really many of these issues affect all synagogues and all rabbis. You've seen brief biographical information about the panelists on our welcoming screen. I want to just share with you what our framing questions are. What trends and development have you seen in the conservative movement? What do congregations want from their rabbis? And what do rabbis want from their Kehilot? What are the essential skills needed and being developed for a rabbi studying today at the Jewish Theological Seminary, at the Ziegler School of Rabbinic Studies, and in other rabbinical schools? How has the skill set changed over the past 2 decades? And how is it continuing to change? What skills are perennial, and what new challenges face contemporary rabbis? What rabbinic skills and philosophy Should a congregation seek in a candidate? And then what are the issues in selecting a rabbi that Kehillat Beth Israel, KBI as it's referred to here, and other congregations should be considering? We're going to call first upon Rabbi Ayelet Cohen, who's the Pearl Resnick Dean of the Rabbinical School and Dean of the Division of Religious Leadership of JTS. And I want to just remind you that all questions should be submitted in the Q&A box below, and we'll get to them after all of the panelists conclude. Rabbi Cohen.
Thank you so much. Thanks so much for inviting me, and it's really an honor to share this virtual room with these wise teachers, and also to join the community in this way. I'm sorry that it wasn't possible to do this in person, but I actually look forward to visiting your community this coming spring for a bar mitzvah. So I look forward to meeting you in person then. These are deep questions, and I think that in some ways, the best way to answer them is to share with you a little bit about what the last 2.5 weeks have been like at JTS, and how our students have been managing and moving through this unimaginable time. I learned little bits of the horrific news that was unfolding running into a neighbor on my way to Shul that Shabbat on Shmini Atzeret, and knew enough to know it was terrible, but I had no idea of the scope of what would unfold. And as I was walking to Shul, I passed, going in the other direction, one of our senior rabbinical students, someone who's in Rabbi Lewittes' Halakha class, who was on her way to her job at Columbia University Hillel. And I wanted to make sure that she knew, as she was about to enter her work as a student rabbi at Hillel, what was unfolding, so she wouldn't be surprised and she wouldn't learn from her students while she was in the middle of davening. And even though I didn't know much, I wanted to just let her know that something terrible was unfolding, and also remind her that her role was not to disseminate information, but to try to be present with the students and hold them in what was clearly going to be a very, very frightening and confusing time. And as I continued my walk to Shul, in addition to all of the fears that I was feeling about my own family in Israel and my friends in Israel and what I imagined might be unfolding, I also was thinking about our students, our third-year class, who was in Jerusalem to begin their year of study at Machon Shechter in Jerusalem, and what might be going on for them. And I was thinking about our most recent graduating class, who had just gone through their first high holidays and were now on the bima, most of them, on Shabbat Shmini Atzeret, and wondering what was happening for them and how they would manage in this moment in their first months of being rabbis. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about what has been going on for them, which I think is a great way to explain what we're trying to teach our rabbis. And rarely has it been so clear for me the immense responsibility of what it is to train future rabbis and cantors for the Jewish people, and how to prepare students for moments like this, which are unbearable and we wish would never happen, and also the everyday moments. So our students in Jerusalem, after a few weeks in the north and high holidays in the north, were just settling into the Jerusalem apartments. And they were on a couple of weeks of vacation for Sukkot before they started classes at Machon Shechter with the Israeli rabbinical students who are studying there. And it was incredible to see how quickly they organized to try to figure out how to be useful. Some of these students had never spent extensive time in Israel before. All of them experienced sirens in Jerusalem and the need to suddenly find out what were the safe rooms and the shelters in their apartments that they were just getting to know. And immediately they wanted to know how we can help. And they started to volunteer in their neighborhoods, babysitting for families whose parents were called to Miluim, visiting elders in nursing homes whose regular visitors had been called away, going to Shiva houses for people they had never met, but they heard didn't have people to visit, standing online for hours and hours to give blood, helping to organize donations for families from the south and now the north who were being resettled in Jerusalem, helping to gather and prepare food to send to soldiers right away. They wanted to know how they could help. Some of them are still in Jerusalem and have started their classes with their Israeli classmates. Some have come to Europe or the States, hopefully for a few weeks, and are hoping to return as soon as they feel safe or their parents feel like it's safe for them to return, and are still asking, how can we help? How can we stay connected to our Israeli classmates, to our faculty? Can I give my apartment that I just left in Jerusalem to a family who needs a place to stay? It's been incredibly moving to see how they have organized and how they have both turned to study them and to help them return to some sense of normalcy, if such a thing is possible, but also as a means of obtaining great meaning. Some of them are studying Talmud in the name of hostages or in the name of soldiers, and are dedicating a daily study practice in their names. And we see, this is more of a real introduction to life in Israel than we had hoped that they would experience in this time. And we know that this experience will stay with them forever, and the relationships that they are building with their teachers, with the people they are volunteering with their future rabbinic colleagues, are going to profoundly influence their lives. They will be lifetime connections and colleagues. And so that's one thing that we know is immensely important in terms of educating our next rabbis and cantors, that they are deeply, deeply engaged with Israel, that wherever they are on the political spectrum, they understand the importance and the intensity of that relationship. They have deep personal relationships and connections, and that they continue to try to understand the contemporary realities so that they will be in a position to help future communities unpack and understand what's going on when that's possible, and simply to be with them and to hold them when that is what is necessary. Right after Chag was over, we reached out to our students who had just graduated last year to find out how they had how they had managed through the Chag, what decisions they made in terms of how to lead their communities through what was supposed to be a joyous moment and had turned into a moment of tremendous, tremendous tragedy, while still the information was unfolding and starting to reach them. And we had similar conversations with our graduating students about what they witnessed in the communities where they spent Chag, what they knew of the decisions that the rabbis and cantors in those communities made around how to make decisions in those early moments, and what they imagined that they would do as about to be rabbis and cantors. And from there, we really were aware of the ways in which we try to help our students prepare for an uncertain world, how we know that they need to be able to turn to text and to prayer for their own spiritual sustenance and also for the sustenance of their communities, how to know which texts to reach for, which prayers to reach for, as your Chazan just so beautifully was able to create a moment of tremendous meaning in a time of tremendous chaos. We want them to know how to access our sacred texts and how to make them alive and real, and draw comfort from them and sustenance from them, and help our communities grow and learn and find comfort by coming into them. We want them to know how to hold communities who might be very unified and might be in different places, and how to make space for different voices and different experiences. You know, some of us immediately went to grief, some of us went to anger, some of us are going back and forth, and it can be hard to be present in a community where people are experiencing very intense and sometimes very different emotions, and while they themselves are experiencing those same emotions. And so we talked a lot about how to be a pastoral presence, and that's something else that we really think about in teaching very practical rabbinical skills. How to be a pastoral presence, how to appropriately experience one's own personal grief and fear while also still being a steady presence for a community, how to be honest about what's hard and what's frightening, and how still to be a steadying and comforting presence. We want them to think about who they can reach out to, whether it's colleagues within the Rabbinate, whether it's local colleagues in other synagogues or other communities of faith, to figure out who their allies are going to be, who they can count on in difficult moments, and how to create powerful moments of communal gathering in difficult times. I also want to tell you about our student Alana, who is working at Columbia Hillel. Columbia University is one of the places, unfortunately, where there has been tremendous turmoil and even some violence and some very, very intense protests between students supporting Israel and between Students for Justice in Palestine. She was actually in the Columbia Hillel building when it had to be locked down for 2.5 hours last week, when one of the protests moved from campus to the corner where Hillel is located. And she, while navigating her own fear, was also able to be present for students and try to steady them and comfort them, to know that she had both her mentors at Hillel and her deans and professors at JTS to figure out how to process what was going on for her. We spoke on, this happened on Thursday night. On Friday morning, we spoke when she was on her way back to Hillel, trying to figure out how to make it Shabbat and what to do for them. And our students and our recent graduates are carrying a tremendous amount. And I have to say, I have been incredibly moved and proud to see how they're thinking about themselves as preparing to be spiritual leaders. A couple of our seniors said, I can imagine that had this happened my first year, I would be thinking, thank goodness I'm only a first year and someone else is going to make this decision. And now they're thinking, I can imagine how I might go about trying to do this. I can imagine myself becoming ready to be a rabbi. And that's all that we can hope, is that through our training in how to be a pastoral presence, how to understand practical skills, how to use our sacred texts, how to understand the world in which we live, how to be in deep relationship with each other, with local colleagues and community, with our colleagues and community in Israel, to understand that we are a global Jewish people, and also how to be present in the most immediate local ways. That's what we hope to give them. And that's what I hope any community can find when you are looking for a rabbi to lead you through the next moment. I know you're being, held this year by your cantor and by two amazing interim rabbis. And I really pray that this search brings you someone who is ready to be with you and to be in community with you in these difficult times.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ayelet. I really appreciate also the immediacy of what everyone's going through. I just came back from Israel last Monday. I've been to many shivas and unfortunately to funerals. And so it's been a very difficult time. And I'm sure it was for the rabbinical students as well. I'm going to ask Rabbi Artson to address those questions as well. In addition to his role as the Abner and Rosalind Goldstein Dean of the Ziegler School of Rabbinic Studies, Rabbi Artson is a scholar whose work emphasizes a process approach to integrating contemporary scientific insights from cosmology, quantum physics, evolutionary theory, and neuroscience into a dynamic view of God. And I'm sure that that comes through as well to your students. What are they going to be in the years to come?
Thank you, Rob Baruch. I appreciate the chance to be here too. I also just, if I could take a moment personally, this is the first time I've gotten to hear Rabbi Cohen teach since she was appointed dean, and I can see why everyone is so thrilled by her leadership and her depth and her wisdom. We're all grateful that you are in this important position, especially now. So really lovely to share a panel with you. I could spend the next 15 minutes just saying ditto, 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 and it would, but I wouldn't say it as well as she did. So I'm going to protect myself by shifting the topic a little bit. And so let me start by Simchat Torah. We all got to shul and we knew we were going to a very different service. It was much more understated. It was, after all, a celebration of Torah, so we couldn't not dance with the Torah, but aware of what was happening to our brothers and sisters in Israel, we couldn't dance the way we would have danced. So at my congregation, we did a couple shorter hakafot, and then we sat on the floor with each other and we just sang nigunim, and we recounted and people spoke their feelings. And I spent the evening with many of my rabbinical students who were in Los Angeles but not working, counseling, teaching, being with them, being a presence for them. And then the next morning, I got on a plane and I flew to Berlin, because I'm not only the dean of a rabbinical school in Los Angeles, but I'm the dean of the newest conservative rabbinical school that trains Masorti rabbis for Europe. It's called the Zacharias Frankel College, and it's located just outside of Berlin at the University of Potsdam, which is a beautiful campus. We have 6 new students starting in Germany, which is for us a bumper number, and they're from all over the place, from Hungary, from Poland, from France, England, Spain, a couple Germans, and there's no one in the rabbinical school who doesn't have family in Israel who are affected by what's going on right now. Loved ones who are in shelter, loved ones who are held hostage. Some have lost loved ones already, and a country being held hostage, even beyond the individuals who are literally being held hostage. So the first thing I noted was just the unity among the rabbinical students, who normally have an incredibly diverse range of opinions on any subject you want, including where should we go for lunch. And ironically, the atrocities of Hamas have brought a togetherness and a singleness of purpose that is, I'm sure, not what they intended, but is really breathtaking to behold. And then a mobilization of what should we be doing and what can we be doing. And I watched as my students in Berlin were getting involved in all kinds of efforts on behalf of Israel and Israeli soldiers. I'll share this news with you because it's quite striking from a North American perspective. The German parliament voted unanimously to condemn Hamas and to stand with Israel. And by unanimously, I mean including the Communist Party. There is a common cause there that is quite astonishing. Okay, second beginning. One of the ways that I waste time is I go onto YouTube, and there are some stations there that have colorized old videos. So you can look at San Francisco in 1906, just before the earthquake. You can go down Market Street and you can see the city. You can go to Paris in the 1890s and watch people walking on the beach. One of the things that is really striking to me is that in those videos, San Francisco, Paris, Berlin, whatever, all of the men have long pants, jackets, ties, and hats. And all of the women have dresses that go down to their ankles, sleeves down to their wrists, and neck pieces up to the top of their necks, everyone without exception. And I want to think about how our culture has changed in the last 100 years, but more especially in the last 20 years. If you were to walk down Market Street today, you would not find anybody dressed like that. And look at this panel, elegant, everyone in their own way, but only one of us is dressed like a fossil, which is to say with a useless piece of cloth around his neck. Things have changed. And I know that one of the challenges from the direction of my generation is the change is terrifying. Because we are conservative Jews, there's much about the past that we venerate and love. And so change threatens what we love and what we know, and it makes us very nervous. Change, let it be said, is not always for the good. Often, change retroactively looks like a terrible mistake, but not always. And so one of the challenges in training rabbis is that Rabbi Cohen and I, she slightly less than me because she's not as ancient as I, are training people to enter a world that we ourselves cannot enter. We can give them what skills we think they will need for their journey, but they're going to go into a place that we can't imagine, and they're going to come up with solutions that we might not endorse, just as we did to the rabbis who came before us. So being open to a process of negotiated change, where rabbinical students reflecting a new generation and different perspectives will try to integrate that into a tradition we all love, and we will provide some resistance to that because of our nature, and because we love the tradition, and because we are rooted in a slightly different world. But I will tell you, every now and again, I see my students say or do things that I would never have imagined. And once my defensive reaction subsides, I think that's actually really good. I didn't know you could do it that way, but that's really great. The first time I went to a Shiva minyan and my students put the chairs in a circle rather than in straight rows like a shul. And I would never have done that, and it was lovely. That's a trivial example of the kinds of things I watch all the time. Rabbi Cohen, I bless you that you should speedily and in our time have the experience of going to visit a student in a congregation, and they do something that in a million years you would never have thought of. And then when someone says, where did they get that from? They turn to you and say, well, this is my teacher. And you want to say, not in that I'm not. I would never have done that. But it's a really good idea. So the work of the Rabbinate and of training the Rabbinate today is, I think, multiple. It is gearing people up with the traditional tools of a rabbi, that is to say, grounded in Hebrew, in traditional texts, in Aramaic, in liturgy, in nusach, in history, in psychology, in counseling, all of the kinds of things. Did I neglect philosophy? Philosophy, all the things that rabbis across the generations have always needed. But there has to be a kind of humility in the teaching, because we're preparing them for a world we are not citizens of, and that we will get to visit occasionally, but mostly look at from a distance. I'm gaining increasing sympathy with Moses, standing on the mountaintop and looking at a land that he has been pining for and can't enter. So there's a paradox to rabbinic training, and I'm going to say one more thing. I don't want to go over too long. I want to highlight that becomes magnified with congregational life. because congregants are grounded in one set of times and expectations. And they're being increasingly served by a generation of rabbis who grew up in a different set of times and expectations. And how we navigate that together will make all the difference. I want to be clear, I'm not saying the students are always right and everyone else needs to get out of their way. I am not saying that. They, like the rest of us, will be taught by life all kinds of insights that their youthful exuberance will have to accommodate. But it's also the job of old people to stay supple and to stay open to the abrasive insights of the young. And there I want to invite the congregation to do the very hard work of not automatically saying no. And here's what I mean by that. Congregations always say they're very interested in change and they're very interested in attracting a younger generation. It's just that any particular change they're opposed to. And that's no surprise because the people in the congregations have navigated and benefited from the existing system, and therefore they don't need those changes. But is there a way that we can redefine ourselves as not just our current membership, but also as the membership we hope to attract, and allow ourselves to be open to what might this look like from their perspective, and how can we anticipate and accommodate that? And let me just be clear about one area that we often have conversations with congregations about issues of gender, of orientation, about expectations, about what counts as normal and whose life arrangements are marginal. And there has been a sea change in that area, probably more than in any other area of life. And learning to be curious and open and embracing to each other, to when we encounter things that aren't the way we expect them to be, to say, teach me, let me learn, or let me get myself educated so that you don't have to be my teacher, but I'll be open to seeing the beauty of your life, your family. That, I think, is going to be crucial for synagogues finding the leadership that they need in the future, because students and rabbis are coming into it with the quite legitimate expectation that their dignity and their distinctiveness will be celebrated. And so finding ways to do that is going to be crucial. Last thing I want to say is that Rav Baruch and I come from what thus far looks like it will be the last surviving generation of workhorse rabbis. That is to say, you want to saddle me up and then load me up with sacks on top of the saddles? Sure, I'll do that. That's what rabbis do. But I can tell you that more and more of my younger colleagues are saying, that's crazy. That's not a way I want to live my life. That is not to say they're not willing to work very, very hard. They certainly are. But they also expect to have time for life. That, I think, is one of their many really surprisingly good ideas. And we all can let them role model for us. What does it mean to share the burden? What does it mean to say, I will help you with this effort, but I will not take it over. I will be a part of your team. I'll even lead the team. But if there's not a team, then it's because we don't really want it. And I also am not going to put time into it. And that's going to be different than the traditional expectation of the rabbi who is always available, always on whatever terms are expected at the moment. And that, I think, we have not yet done the work of helping our congregations anticipate, plan for, and accommodate.
Thank you. Yes, I am part of that last generation of workhorses. But it's been good. I want to just stress that. It's also been good. I want to call upon Rabbi Adina Lewittes, who is an innovative and exciting teacher, speaker, writer, and creative voice. She's a member of the faculty of the Shalom Hartman Institute, of JTS and the Rabbinical School teaching Halacha, and she's going to be Rabbi in residence here in Ottawa in the winter, which is when I agreed, I said, I'll do the fall semester and I'll do the spring semester, but not the winter. And Rabbi Lewittes said, I love the winter. So they are waiting for you. Can you help us a little bit? What are you experiencing? And also because you've been out in the field in a different way for a number of years, what are you seeing?
I will get you snowshoeing and cross-country skiing with me before you know it. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for having me. It is really nice to have the opportunity to engage with the community before taking up my role at KBI. It's a great honor to be on this panel with Dr. Wertheimer, with Rabbi Cohen, Rabbi Artson, and especially with you, Rav Baruch Frydman-Kohl, with whom I'm sharing the pulpit at KBI. I want to begin by saying that the savage genocidal attack in Israel on October 7th has, as we've heard already, in many ways sharpened the issues that we're here to talk about, and certainly intensified the urgency of them as Israel not only fights for its physical safety, but as the Jewish people around the world fight to promote moral clarity together with a deep sense of spiritual mission and Jewish purpose that have animated our 4,000 plus years of existence and that are needed to secure a robust and vital Jewish future in Israel and throughout the Jewish world. To answer the questions that have been posed to us tonight, I want to begin by saying that essentially I see today in the conservative movement the same trends that have distinguished us since our inception. The tensions between, as we used to say, tradition and change, or preservation and innovation, but of course, they're playing out on a dramatically changed and still rapidly evolving landscape wherein patterns of Jewish engagement, belief, and belonging are all being redesigned, as they are in other faith communities as well. For our purposes, I'll note just three of its main features. We live today in a flat, networked, tech-saturated society that's no longer defined by hierarchically imposed values or vision, but one wherein identity and belonging are shaped by access, fluidity, often hybridity, by a do-it-yourself culture that prizes individuality, all of which summons a reimagining of what rabbinic leadership and rabbinic authority really mean today. The boundaries that once segmented cultures and religious communities have become permeable in ways unimaginable just a generation ago, creating the most diverse Jewish people ever, both in terms of the makeup of our families and communities and in the range of Jewish beliefs and values and practices that animate them. And more, the self-claimed distinctions between religious and secular have also given way to a more nuanced expression of Jewish identity, wherein the motivations and inspirations that bring people to Jewish life or that keep them away from it can no longer be so easily assumed or labeled, a reality which requires rabbinic leadership to develop the skills to engage both the non-believer who attends daily minyan and the spiritual seeker who eschews institutional religion, and everyone in between. What's interesting to me about this moment is that the conventional teams, if you will, in this struggle seem to have diversified as well. There are congregations with rabbis who yearn to bring more innovation, creativity, and diversity to their rabbinic work, who are frequently stymied by boards who may not have the appetite or the vision, or perhaps even the courage to take the risks that change requires. And we also have shul communities who yearn for more innovation, creativity, and diversity in their spiritual and communal lives, but who are frequently stymied by rabbis who may not have the appetite or the vision or perhaps the courage to take the risks that change requires. We know that decisions made from fear and decisions avoided from fear rarely end up serving us or the people we serve. This reality, I think, calls for a rebalancing of our historic embrace of both the unchanging and the evolving in Jewish life and practice, that sacred dynamism at the heart of traditional Judaism, rooted in the Talmud with branches and blossoms throughout the ensuing millennia of Jewish scholarship and leadership. A dynamism which, more than any other Jewish community, I think the conservative movement has the theological, the halachic, and the ideological tools to embrace with conviction, with integrity, and with courage. We've done so in the past, and we can and ought to do so again now. I'm going to speak to the question about what essential skills are needed or being developed from my perspective, having spent 30 years as a community rabbi, and also from my experience teaching in the rabbinical school at JTS for the last 3 years, where 28 years ago I served as the assistant dean. There are essential skills a rabbi needs that remain constant even as the world around us changes so dramatically. These include pastoral empathy and insight, stellar people skills, academic and intellectual strength, an engaging teaching style, public speaking skills, an ability to be spiritually inspiring, competent managerial skills, a decent sense of humor, and let's be honest, thick skin. What I feel passionately about is the need for rabbis in our rabbinic community to build some new muscle for the particular orientation that this moment in history calls for, which, as I mentioned, in some ways is not new at all, and in other ways is radically so. The undeniable reality of our time, as I described it, is that there are many different ways to lead a meaningful and engaged Jewish life. Religious practice and halachic observance is one, and they are cherished and vaunted hallmarks of our movement. But as we all know, there are people, including in our own communities, who are living rich Jewish lives shaped by other Jewish priorities and callings, such as a deep and textured commitment to Jewish culture, to Israel, to the arts, to repairing the world, and more. And as I said earlier, our sanctuary pews are also filled with many who might describe themselves, in the words of sociologist Charles Liebman, as a secular Jewish maximalist, people who are there not out of any vigorous theological position, not out of any sense of faith, but out of an appreciation for the power of ritual and of community, who are looking to be engaged in ways that resonate with their intellectual and social values, if not with any particular religious convictions. And all of this at a time when demographers cite the growing numbers of Jews who describe themselves as secular, more drawn to Judaism as their heritage than as a framing for belief or a call to surrender to rabbinic dictates. I do share the skepticism of those who question whether it's enough for someone to say they just live by Jewish values. We know that for an identity to be considered thick enough, it must be transmissible to the third generation. And simply referring to amorphous ideas without disciplined, recognizable behavioral engagement with them doesn't inspire much confidence in its ability to be replicated in any meaningful way. But still, that disciplined, recognizable behavioral engagement with Judaism can and does take many forms, and that requires some new rabbinic skills or new rabbinic vision. When I was a rabbinical student 35 years ago, we were taught that our mission is to educate and inspire our congregants and students to make the same Jewish choices as we do, privileging one model of Jewish life. I don't think that mission can sustain a vibrant Jewish future. We need to be training rabbis to educate, inspire, empower, and guide people to make the Jewish choices that are most authentic and meaningful to them, choices that will stand a better chance of being reinforced and transmitted. Our goal should be to have Jewish people of all backgrounds and sensibilities take ownership of their Jewish lives and live them with integrity, with responsibility and purpose. That's what I think would make for a strong Jewish future. And to state the obvious, the Jewish future is about more than the future of conservative Judaism. It's about a strong and united Jewish people in the fullness and manifold beauty of our growing diversity. Certainly, the conservative movement has a role to play in building that future. We need rabbis who are unafraid to minister to people who may make very different choices than they do around what to eat, how to keep Shabbat, even whom to marry. And rabbis who know that we can be in deep rabbinic relationships with people who make different choices and not have our rabbinic leadership implicated by those decisions that are different than our own. We need rabbis to offer excellence, integrity, inspiration, and beauty in the familiar spaces of prayer and ritual and observance, and keep affirming and celebrating our pluralistic embrace of the many different ways we fulfill mitzvot. For example, in my class at JTS, where I teach contemporary halakha to rabbinical students, we look at a variety of halachic questions that are arising from the evolving social landscape I described before, and that are challenging the boundaries in which Jewish norms and patterns have historically lived. Questions such as new approaches to bodily disposition upon death, lab-produced meat, and those that pertain to the trans-Jewish community, such as whether a trans woman who is still anatomically male requires a brit milah, circumcision, if she's converting to Judaism. We wrestle with what remains core to genuine Jewish expression and what might need to be or can be reimagined in light of the needs of today. We in the conservative movement remain distinguished not just by our devotion to the sources and precedents that have shaped Jewish life in the past, but by our courage to continue the Talmud's formidable willingness to ask the hard, complex, yet urgent questions of its time, and to evolve Jewish responses that are rooted in the past, responsive to the present, and invested in the future. Rabbis and congregations today, I think, should feel empowered to ask, what does prayer mean to Jewish people in the 21st century, given the wide variety of beliefs that bring people to services? We should be open to asking, what are people today seeking from prayer? What is it that people are yearning to say, yearning to hear, yearning to feel? And we should be comfortable, rabbis and communities, experimenting with different kinds of minyanim and spiritual gatherings, learning from them. But we can't only measure the success of our congregations by how many people come to shul on Shabbat or Yom Tov morning, or who observe Jewish law. We have to start also measuring our success by how we're helping people live rich, committed, meaningful Jewish lives of all kinds that they are called to live. So we also need to teach rabbis to bring that same excellence, integrity, inspiration, and beauty to the creative and innovative spaces in ways that people are seeking Jewish experience and belonging, especially in this age when formal prayer services are proving to be less and less of a draw. We have to teach rabbis to stop worrying over how many people enter the building and instead teach them to help people experience spaces of all kinds as having the potential to touch them Jewishly. Museums and art galleries, hiking trails and mountaintops, book talks and poetry readings, yoga classes and meditation retreats, homeless shelters and soup kitchens. We are in possession of the most wondrous treasure of Jewish texts and melodies, stories, holidays, and rituals, all of which can be harnessed to frame an endless variety of opportunities to strengthen Jewish identity, to create encounters with Jewish spirituality, and to create a culture of Jewish belonging. To borrow from a conversation I had recently with Rabbi Jacob Blumenthal, the CEO of both the Rabbinical Assembly and the United Synagogue of Conservative Judaism, the rabbi and the synagogue need to learn to see themselves not as the singular model of Jewish life to which all must aspire, but as a center of Jewish gravity from which people can grow along their own paths, returning regularly for education, inspiration, and affirmation. There are successful models for this kind of reimagined synagogue. I'm proud to have built and led one called Sha'ar Communities for over 20 years in northern New Jersey and New York City. And there are so many others being built and led by our own colleagues and those in other movements as well. We have much to learn from them all. There is another dimension to this as well. In our increasingly complex world, more Jewish people, especially young people, see their Jewish identities being played out in larger societal settings, ones that are engaged in such urgent and no less Jewish issues like racial justice and climate change. Rabbis need to be able to guide people to raise an informed, responsible, and compassionate Jewish voice in today's broader conversations about societal, environmental, and moral sustainability that are taking place in our own countries, around the world, and of course in Israel. Fundamentally, our rabbis need to understand and teach that continuity must mean more than just replication. We need our rabbis to help families wrestle deeply with their Jewish identity and values and guide them to articulate and embody them for the next generation. For synagogues, it means not just putting on the same program every year, using the same flyer, but changing the date, but rather assessing the spiritual needs of the community and mining the tradition with open minds and hearts and eyes to enable abiding wisdom and values to speak to an ever-changing people. We need rabbis who are bold enough to lead, knowing that authenticity is measured by more than just consistency, but by learning how to show up in life in Jewish spaces and beyond with integrity and honesty and commitment. Now, obviously, when choosing a rabbi, there has to be a match of personality and vision between a rabbi and the shul, but there should also be opportunity for each to be moved and inspired by the other to keep growing and keep evolving. Each should challenge the other, help refine the other, build a relationship that keeps them grounded, yet reaching, rooted, yet seeking, unafraid of the risks of change, undeterred by potential failure and the need to rethink, and together not just committed to the future of the Jewish people, but to the future of Jewish people. I want to close by saying that, and I've said it repeatedly and publicly, that I think the conservative movement possesses everything necessary to offer the most compelling frame for Jewish life in the 21st century, as people seek a sense of rootedness, even as they live in a dynamic and diverse world, as people seek integrity and meaning, as people seek connection and belonging, they seek learning and exploration. Our commitments to an evolutionary legal tradition, to halachic pluralism, to theological humility, to spiritual audacity and moral courage are among the most precious and effective tools in our toolbox. It is time to sharpen them and to put them into renewed service. And I'll just at the very end share two timeless lessons that I learned about being a rabbi from one of the most cherished of my role models, a person I know some of you at KBI knew yourselves. I'm referring to my grandfather, Rabbi Mendel Lewittes, Zichrono Livracha, who was the rabbi at Young Israel in Montreal, where I grew up until he and my grandmother made Aliyah in 1969. He was a rabbi whose intellectual prowess informed his halachic courage as well as his broad vision for the Jewish future, one anchored in the redemptive rebirth of Medinat Yisrael. The two teachings that I want to share with you that I learned from him, one addresses the community and one addresses rabbis. To communities struggling with the tensions we've been discussing, to communities who are exploring the various sources of authority to which they feel beholden and accountable. My grandfather stressed the importance of the Talmudic dictum in Masechet Rosh Hashanah, which says, Ein lecha lelech ela etzel shofet shebeyamav, that we need only to go to the judge in one's days. In other words, it is they who are leading in that moment who are authorized to judge and decide matters. Only the judge of that day can understand and appreciate the requirements of their day. In other words, have trust in your rabbis to understand and assess the circumstances and settings in which great and urgent Jewish questions are being asked that require thoughtful and responsible answers. Congregations together with their rabbis should live and lead from hope, not from fear, from trust and not despair. Hope and trust in their communities, in their families, and in themselves. And for rabbis who might be uncertain of how their loyalties to the past can play out in a time of great change, my grandfather would offer the following lesson. For most of halachic history, the mark of a Talmid Chacham was a sage who could find a kula, a leniency, finding a way through restrictions and precedents in order to offer a compassionate and relevant Jewish path forward. For the last 100 years, the mark of a Talmid Chacham was someone who actually could find a chumrah, a stricture. That's hardly a challenging feat. My grandfather, an Orthodox rabbi, deplored the calcification of Jewish law, finding it to be a betrayal of our tradition, not a protection of it. In one of the more memorable discussions I had with him, he taught me in his words the difference between a rabbi and a parrot. A parrot merely repeats everything that was taught to it, mimicking a tradition. But a rabbi takes everything they've learned and expresses it in an idiom that is sensible and meaningful for the audience to whom they speak, the people whom they're honored to lead, those who turn to them for meaning and inspiration. As we continue to reel from the atrocities and the horrors that are unfolding in Israel, as it continues to bring with it all the uncertainty and the risk that it carries, and as we desperately continue to pray for a restored path to peace, I want to conclude my remarks by saying something that I've tried to say repeatedly over the last 18 days, whether to my students at JTS, to couples I'm marrying, and to synagogues like KBI planning its next chapter. While we're doing everything we can to support those in need whose lives have been shattered and whose lives remain in danger, continuing to strengthen our Jewish communities and to build the Jewish future are also ways of contributing, of showing unity, of resisting the savage forces of evil in the world. Teaching, planning Jewish communal programs, and even celebrating Jewish life cycle events all convey our unyielding devotion to a robust Jewish future that no force of hate and no force of brutality can diminish or defeat. These are among the most important things we can be doing right now. And in that spirit, thank you, KBI, for bringing us together tonight for this important discussion.
Adina, thank you very, very much. Rabbi Lewittes, you articulated a whole vision, and I know it's coming out of your history and your teaching and your life. And it's nice to be able to bring your grandfather in as well. There's multiple generations going on. And that creates a kind of historical flow. We happen to have a historian here. Professor Jack Wertheimer is not only a historian of conservative Judaism, but of American Judaism. He's written widely and deeply about American Judaism, its dynamic and its change, as well as how it seeks to hold on to things from the past, very much as each of you have identified that dynamic. And I'm interested in hearing from you. You asked me from some data as well about the congregation, and you may have some other reflections as well. So, Professor Wertheimer.
Thank you. So first of all, thank you, Rabbi Baruch, for inviting me. And I just want to express my pleasure to be on the panel with such articulate and thoughtful fellow panelists. Congratulations to all of you for your remarks. I am the lone non-rabbi on this panel. I'm neither a rabbi nor the son of a rabbi, although my uncle was a conservative rabbi. And I mention this because my approach, therefore, really will be the approach of both an observer of American Judaism, which I've studied for quite a while, but also as a member of a conservative synagogue for many decades. And I'd like to share with you some reflections about that. I'm going to address myself to two themes. One of them is what are we seeing specifically in conservative synagogues in the United States that might have parallels in Ottawa and in other congregations? And the second question is, what might you consider as you search for a new rabbi? Certainly a topic that my fellow panelists had touched upon as well. As for the first topic, that is the, if you will, the condition of conservative synagogues, we see contradictory trends at work. On the one hand, many conservative synagogues have closed, merged, or disaffiliated from the United Synagogue. It would be interesting, by the way, to know more about the last group. There are unaffiliated congregations that certainly appear to fit into a conservative Judaism mold. To cite two prominent examples, B'nai Jeshurun in New York City and Ikara in Los Angeles. If one didn't know when stepping into those congregations what their affiliation or non-affiliation is, they certainly appear to be within the conservative framework. More worrisome than the disaffiliation are national surveys showing plummeting numbers of American Jews self-identify as conservative Jews, and that their behavior and commitments also are far removed from what the conservative movement has stood for. I'm not aware of a study that has asked, and I'm going to use a loaded term here in quotation marks, the defectors, why they have checked out. And so we have to rely very much on speculation. By defectors, what I'm really talking about is people who are raised within the conservative movement, but no longer self-identify that way or live their lives that way. And so I'm going to be citing three possible explanations for the decline that we do see in conservative synagogue life. One of them is that many conservative synagogues had convinced themselves over a long period of time that a smattering of Jewish knowledge and a well-orchestrated bar bat mitzvah day would be sufficient to keep young Jews committed to Jewish life, let alone to conservative synagogues when they reach adulthood. That has proven to be a fantasy. Absent intensive and immersive Jewish education and social experiences with other young Jews, it is highly unlikely that a person will grow up to join and attend a conservative synagogue, although I certainly am aware that there are many exceptions to that. But that having been said, services in conservative synagogues are long, and they're conducted primarily in Hebrew, and the liturgy is quite alien, unless one has the skills and knowledge that are necessary to get what is going on. A second factor that would explain this decline in the population of members of conservative synagogues is the staggeringly high rate of intermarriage that has swept intermarrying Jews away from conservative synagogues and have taken their parents along with them. There has been a debate in the conservative Rabbinate about whether a more welcoming approach, however that is defined, to the intermarried will stop or at least slow the process of defection. For my part, I don't see why a non-Jewish partner would want to sit through long services in Hebrew when other movements with shortened services and fewer inhibitions about granting synagogue honors to non-Jews eagerly embrace intermarried families. And the third item I would cite here is the general turn within American society against institutions and heightened and also the heightened individualism that are evident throughout American society. These both affect synagogues as well, and though the topic is not much discussed, movements other than Orthodoxy are also losing members. That said, as I said before, there are contradictory trends, and I don't want to portray the condition of conservative synagogues as only dire, because we know, and most recently, Rabbi Lewittes alluded to this quite directly. We know that there are many synagogues with highly creative tefillah, educational programs, social programs, efforts to reach out beyond themselves. I could go on, but these are synagogues that have taken initiatives to address the contemporary world in very creative ways. So this is not solely a story of decline, but to an extent of consolidation. And understandably, therefore, there is a lot of concern about retention and growth. And in this connection, I want to turn to your particular congregation, and perhaps others that are represented with listeners who are watching this particular evening's discussion. Because in the background of the search committee, based upon a brief outline that was kindly drafted for me about what the priorities are of your search, 2 of the 4 top priorities address the question of growth in numbers and retention. So clearly this is something on your minds, and understandably so. I'm not in no way knocking those understandable concerns, but I do want to introduce a couple of questions for you, this congregation, and others searching for a new rabbi to consider as you prioritize, because you must prioritize in your search. I am delighted and frankly quite surprised that so far the book titled The New Rabbi, authored by Stephen Fried, has not yet been mentioned, which is great because it provides an opening for me. But this is a study, if you're not familiar with it, that was written quite a while ago about a search on the part of a conservative synagogue for a new rabbi. And the way in which that search was conducted. And I want to just read one brief, but one sentence, although it's a longer sentence, that kind of captures what the author of this book learned about the congregation's search for a new rabbi. I'm quoting now: "Congregations all want someone who attends every meeting and is at his desk working until midnight." The gender here is male, but this was at a time when the conservative movement was not yet ordaining women. To continue now with the quotation: "Someone who is 28 years old, but has preached for 30 years. Someone who has a burning desire to work with teenagers, but spends all of his time with senior citizens. Basically, someone who does everything well and will stay with the congregation forever," end quote. Now, on some level, perhaps he's writing this somewhat tongue-in-cheek, but the truth is that in many searches, because of the diversity of opinions within congregations, it is very difficult to prioritize what it is that a congregation seeks. You have gotten further, because you've been able to identify at least 4 top responsibilities that you expect of your new rabbi. And I just want to quote here what was sent to me, which reflects that steps towards that prioritization. Number 1, leadership, leading the congregation with spiritual and practical ideas that will help it continue to grow. 2, membership, retaining current members while attracting and integrating younger families and individuals. 3, education, delivering and supervising education programs for various ages and providing rabbinical leadership to KBI's Hebrew Religious School, the Ottawa Talmud Torah, and our J-Teen program. And fourth, pastoral care, reaching out to congregants, including those who are unwell, to provide connections, counsel, and guidance. So here are the top priorities. But in my mind, at least, they raise a couple of questions that I'd like to share with you. How open are you to a rabbi who will introduce changes to the tefillah and other realms? Are you looking for someone with a few new ideas or with a broader vision of the shul that will require a far-reaching set of changes? If you currently do not have musical instruments in use during the davening, would you introduce them if the new rabbi urged such a step? If the new rabbi wants to officiate at intermarriage ceremonies to retain older members who have adult children who are intermarrying, would you support such a step? These are but a few examples of what rabbis have been doing to retain members. 2, to what extent do you want a rabbi who will try to influence congregants to deepen their Jewish observances and their types of Jewish engagement? 3, a focus on educational leadership requires a very different set of skills than pastoral care. And if you recall, the third and fourth items that I read to you of the priorities state educational leadership and pastoral care. If nothing else, one is focused on the youngest population and the other mainly on an older population within the congregation. Which would you prioritize? Or do you imagine that a rabbi can easily span that wide a spectrum? And if the new rabbi wishes to rejuvenate the board by involving younger members, people in their 20s and 30s, would that fly? To what extent do you want a rabbi who serves as a role model? And if so, what would that model be? As one committed to spirituality and connection with God? As one committed to Jewish learning? As one committed to social justice work outside the synagogue? Or something else? Another question, what about a rabbi who wants to run programs that cost money, but will bring non-members into the synagogue and thereby take the chance that some will join eventually? I ask because bringing in new members does not necessarily happen without risk-taking. Would you run musical programs or service programs or special worship programs for healing and spirituality that are mainly directed to non-members as a way to learn what would appeal to Jews who are not currently members, but might eventually consider joining? This has been an issue in conservative synagogues and synagogues in general. To what extent do you try to reach out to non-members and invest some money in that process? That has occasioned pushback from members of congregations who said, wait a minute, we want the rabbi to focus upon our needs and not on the needs of non-members. And then when it comes to attracting new members, how much of the rabbi's time would you tolerate that rabbi spending on outreach versus interacting with those who already are members? My purpose in raising these questions is to help you, or encourage you at least, to refine your priorities. Simply put, you will have to be clearer on what is most important for the simple reason that no individual rabbi will have all the strengths in the areas that you've outlined. So my question is, what is most important to you? Finally, from what I've observed, the success of new rabbis does not depend solely upon the skills that he or she brings to the task, but also it depends upon the willingness of board members and others to protect the rabbi from harsh critics and provide the rabbi with the time to demonstrate that the ideas, the vision of that rabbi actually can take hold and have a positive influence. Therefore, what is the willingness that the board and the search committee, for that matter, have to support the rabbi that you are going to be choosing? And with that, I wish you much success in your search process. Thanks.
Wow, lots of interesting questions. By the way, I'm sure that everyone noticed a lot of the issues are phrased differently, but they are actually the same issues we're talking about. Everybody's focusing on how much of the dynamic between the rabbi and the congregational leadership. How flexible is each? How do you negotiate that arrangement? How much do you go outside of the walls of the synagogue? What do you do to build the interior of the membership, both the spiritual interior individually and the interior of the programmatic and the ritual parts of the synagogue? So I want to thank you all for what is a really comprehensive way of enabling people in general and our congregation in particular to think about these issues. There are questions that people have asked individually, and I'm going to raise them sort of one by one, and I'll let you decide how you want to respond to them. They may be more appropriate for one person or another. So the first question is directed specifically to Rabbi Cohen, but I think it has impact for others. How are you preparing students to be more than or different from social workers? What should a synagogue be expecting from its rabbi? And particularly in a difficult time like this. But after you, Rabbi Cohen, Ayelet, I'm sure that others may have their inputs as well.
So I think, as was raised by a number of our teachers tonight, there isn't necessarily one thing or a right set of things that a particular synagogue should be looking for from its leadership. I think as part of the search process, it's really important to go through a process of discernment to figure out what are the priorities in the community in terms of what you're seeking in a rabbi. As Dr. Wertheimer mentioned, we can make up these endless lists of the perfect attributes of the perfect rabbi. We will have before us human beings with many skills and gifts and also limitations. And it's very important to think not only about the mythical perfect rabbi, but also what would be a good fit for a particular community and what are the needs that are really emerging as priorities. So it's very hard to answer that question on the outside. And I would imagine that even within your community and within your search committee, there are different voices in terms of what do you miss from the last rabbi? What do you wish you had that you haven't had? All of those kinds of things. This is a really important period of discernment to do that. I think we are absolutely preparing rabbis to be much more than social workers. I think that Rabbi Artson and I both talked about pastoral care and pastoral skills. In some ways, I think that was something that wasn't always emphasized in rabbinic education. And there was a lot of focus on textual skills and facility with the books, which we continue to believe is very, very important. We also are very aware that interpersonal skills are very important and that being able to guide people through difficult moments and joyful moments of life is essential. And so to figure out that combination of how to draw from classical texts and Jewish knowledge in a way, as Rabbi Lewittes said, that takes into account contemporary reality and the contemporary needs of a community and the reality of a particular community. That may mean that rabbis, who are appearing for interviews don't look like the rabbi you might have in your imagination of what you thought you would have. And that could open the door to wonderful surprises of people who might actually be fantastic fits if we're able to kind of open ourselves to the scope of what a rabbi could look like. I see Rabbi Artson is unmuted, so I'll pass the baton to you.
Thank you, Rabbi Cohen. Ditto. And I just want to draw attention and not let it pass that we talk about being more than a social worker as though being a social worker is assumed. And I don't think that was the case in my day. the idea that you would talk to a rabbi about a personal problem. I remember I was a chaplain at Sloan Kettering, which is a hospital for cancer patients in Manhattan during my time at JTS. And I walked into the room of someone who was very observant. So-and-so, I'm the rabbinic chaplain. How can I help you? And she said, why do I need a rabbi? I don't have a chicken for you to look at. And so I want to say that training a rabbi to be empathic and compassionate and to see the individual in front of them, and then be able to be sufficiently rooted in the tradition that they can distill from the tradition that which would help the person in front of them thrive or get through a particular moment. That's a unique cluster of skills that only rabbis provide. Not more than social workers, but definitely including pastoral training and depth coupled with the kind of textual fluency that is not about scholarship on its own grounds, but engaged in helping the work of building better people and stronger communities.
So that's a very important concept in adult education. We talk not only about conveying information, but also conveying meaning. It's an anthropological approach to study. A question for Rabbi Artson, unless do either
I actually would. May I just add a word or so on this point? When I heard the question, I heard something slightly different. This is not a pejorative comment about social work, but rather that the approach of social work is far more value neutral. What I have been concerned for quite a while now about the extent to which rabbis are prepared to do what rabbis in the past did, namely to stand for a normative tradition, as opposed to the kind of counseling and neutral approach that people in the healthcare profession must embrace. And so that's why I respond to the question on the level of, are rabbis prepared to act and to speak out of a normative tradition? And that's a very different approach.
So let me take that and use this as a question that's addressed to Rabbi Lewittes. With great enthusiasm, you seem to say that almost anything goes, as long as it is sincere and soulful. Is this something Jewish? Many Canadian United Church ministers can say what you said, regardless of their position on Israel. And the question is, what is are there borders? And I guess that sort of relates to a little bit of what Dr. Wertheimer said as well.
It's not an uncommon response to the ideas that I've put out, and I want to make myself very clear. Of course, it's not anything goes. At the same time, we have to recognize the reality of the trends that are shaping most significantly the younger generation, but also people in other age groups who are looking for different ways of engaging Jewishly and being in relationship to our tradition, and who are seeking a deep sense of belonging, even as they search for a path that feels authentic and purposeful for them. I think it's very dangerous to assume that a vision for Jewish life that acknowledges the very real diversity of inspiration and practice is by definition something that has no standards. To be progressive to be liberal does not mean to have no standards. What it does mean is that this is a moment, I believe, that calls for the resourcefulness and for the courage to recognize that my Jewish choices, my Jewish values, my Jewish practice, and my Jewish commitment is not the only path in which people will find meaning and fulfillment as a Jew. So that my inspiration and mission as a rabbi is not necessarily to educate and inspire people to become versions of me. My mission and purpose as a rabbi is to educate and inspire and empower people to live their best, most authentic Jewish life with a deep sense of responsibility and commitment. I no longer see the contribution that rabbis can make in the imagery of being gatekeepers, of being the owners of Judaism and Jewish tradition, but being the facilitators of the varieties of Jewish lives that will make up our Jewish future. What we can do is be leaders who continue to articulate a compelling set of values and teachings and practices, who continue to convey the beauty and urgency of creating inclusive and welcoming communities, and to help people find their way in them. And as I said before, I think building a world in which people take deep ownership over their own Jewish lives is a world in which we have a greater chance of seeing Judaism sustained for the robust and long future that we wish to see ahead.
Thank you. So this is a question that was really for Rabbi Artson, but I think is broadly spoken. Many congregations, including this one, have embraced a vast number of changes. A full egalitarian model, diverse gender orientation, etc. What role does a rabbi play in a congregation that has embraced change? And along with that came the following question. So should we relax halachic barriers to even more new things, such as computers on Shabbat? And isn't this the meaning of change?
So there's a certain category of questions that I categorize as, hi, we've pulled the pin out of this hand grenade, Rabbi, will you hold it for a moment? That's in that category. So I will answer the part of the question that's safe to answer. Change is just the unfolding of tradition that has yet to already establish a consensus. And in that regard, I'm very Darwinian. I love the fact that our movement has an enormous diversity of practice within it, because we just don't know where the future is going to go, what response the world is going to circle around. And it may be, in many cases, it never hardens around a particular and single approach. It may be that for the foreseeable future, there are multiple possibilities, sometimes within the same congregation and sometimes beyond the same congregation. I think what the question says wisely, and now I will step my foot in it, is that once we demonstrate that something is possible, it's very hard to say, okay, time's up, we're going back. My favorite example of that from around 2,000 years ago is after the destruction of the temple, when the shofar was blown in the temple for the high holidays. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was approached about blowing the shofar on Rosh Hashanah, and he had his people blow it, and they said, well, shouldn't we talk about it? And he said, well, blow it now and we'll talk about it later. And then a year later, when he took out the shofar to have them blow it, They said, well, shouldn't we talk about it now? And he said, no, there's already a tradition. We should just keep blowing it. Having demonstrated to the conservative world that it is now possible to participate in Shabbat services on Zoom, I don't see any going back, personally. I also don't think there should be any going back. I am not one of the people who decries the driving tshuva. I think the driving tshuva didn't create a sociological reality. I think it responded to a sociological reality. And I think that bemoaning the loss of a fantasy era is never a good posture for a religious group. I personally did not find the online services spiritually satisfying. I don't know about you, but going to a service where I look at my rabbi's face blown up to cover the entire screen for the entire 3 hours is not what I'm coming to religion for, although my rabbi has a very wise and compelling face. That's not in any way a criticism of my rabbi's face. But I like to look away, and I like to stare at the walls, and I like to space out, and I like to come back. And I think that's part of the Jewish liturgy and why the service takes so long, and why I think it's a good idea, because you need to have time to dream. So even though it doesn't work for me, I just know a ton of people for whom it works. And I'll give you one concrete, for instance, and then I have a closing statement about the last question. My wife, Ilana, who is the daughter of the conservative movement and grew up at Adat Ariel here, and then came with me to New York to JTS and has put up with all kinds of rabbinic work for her husband all these years. During the plague, she would get up at 6:30 to go to the Adas in Washington, D.C., because she loved those two rabbis and she loves that cantor. And so she did that before going with us all to Ikar. So she was at the early and the late service every Shabbat of COVID, and on a voluntary basis. Why would you take that away from her? Why would you take away from someone who can't get out of the house the ability to participate in services? I don't think it's a threat to people. I don't think most people are going to choose that over going to synagogue in person. But even if they did, so what? If that's how people find community, I think that that's how they find community, and that we should be able to do it. Last thing I want to say about the nefarious nature of change. At most conservative services, I have the pleasure, like Professor Wertheimer, of doing scholar in residence gigs at conservative synagogues all across North America. It's really great. I love seeing the communities. I love seeing what's going on. Let me tell you what goes on at every single shul, that the old-fashioned seminary graduate in me bristles at every time under his breath. I become one of those old muttering Muppets. At this moment in the service, we stand for the silent prayer, and the rabbi says something along the lines of, please feel free to use the words of the prayer book, which are found on pages thus and such to thus and so, or close the book and use the words of your heart. And under my breath, I say, if you don't want to be Yotzi, right? Because, of course, the rabbis have absolutely no intention of you saying the words that are in your heart. They think you're obligated to say the words in the book. There's no tshuva on this. The movement never voted on this, but it has been unanimously adopted by every single conservative rabbi whose synagogue I have been in. Without exception, they all tell people it's okay to close the book. We can either harumph at that like the old Muppets we are, or we can say, is that really a threat to the future of the Jewish people? And maybe there are bigger things that require our attention, and maybe we should approach this with curiosity and say, what is this alerting me to that needs my attention? Maybe we need to help people see why this is like a libretto. It's a classic, the Siddur, and help them appreciate it as poetry, not as literal prose. Maybe we need to be comfortable with having time in the service where they do get permission to close the book. Maybe that's the time. But I think that being open to the recognition that everybody in a previous generation is offended by the service of the generation after it, and that's not actually something new. I think that the world would be better if we harumphed less.
I just want to add very briefly. I think one of the things that makes training rabbis and becoming rabbis both challenging and complicated and extremely rich in this moment is they need to learn how to do both. You know, if we think about prayer leadership as an example, I think a lot about how everyone who graduates from our schools, we want them to know how to lead a traditional daven through service, you know, shacharit, mincha, marav, that they would feel comfortable if at the last minute someone said, Rabbi, will you lead us in mincha? And they can do it. But also they need to know how to lead other modalities of prayer if they find themselves in a place where the desire and expectation is to introduce tefillot with a kavanah, with an intention to draw people in. They need to also know how to lead a community in more communal singing. So actually, just being fluent in one modality isn't enough anymore. We really need to teach more than one. And everyone, you know, most people have their preference and the way they would like to be it, but we also know that we might find ourselves in places that stretch us, and we need our rabbis to be prepared to meet those communities and certainly bring them new things and help them be on journeys, but also to be able to function in different modalities. And it's pretty amazing to watch people stretch to learn how to inhabit different styles.
So I'm going to raise a question that two people have sent me, and they're phrased slightly differently, but essentially, and this is initially to Dr. Wertheimer, but I think it's to everyone. What about those who have defected from the conservative movement because they were inspired to be more halachically observant? And they were inspired by Camp Ramah, by USY, by Nativ, by the programs that the conservative movement has created, but they didn't find support for that in their conservative synagogues. And somebody else asked, what can a rabbi do to support and help build communities that are committed to that kind of halachic observance? So to you first, Jack, and then to everybody else, because this is coming from the other side of the change side.
Sure, and it's a very difficult question to answer, but I suppose I would link it to the previous discussion, where particularly the point that Rabbi Artson made about this option that rabbis offer congregants, and on one level, one can say, sure, people should be given the option not only but to encourage people to speak what's in their hearts, to address God with what is in their hearts. But my question is, to what extent does a rabbi feel a responsibility to educate congregants so that they can find their way through a Siddur, that they can find meaning in the Tefillot, that they can understand what the structure of a Siddur or Machzor is, and why these prayers are there, and what these prayers allude to. And here there really is a question, again, I believe, of priorities. Is the priority to help people feel comfortable as they are, or is the priority to try to move people along and thereby create pardon my language here, a davening congregation? People who do not open this or close the Siddur are not a davening congregation in that sense. And there are consequences to that. And the consequences are in the question that was just posed, that those people who are interested in davening have been checking out. And this has been going on for quite a long period of time. So I circle back to my point, priorities. What are the priorities? What are you trying to create? What kind of religious community are you trying to create in your synagogue? And to what extent are the applicants, the candidates that you are considering, prepared to further that goal of creating the kind of religious community you would like to see?
Other people want to comment?
Yeah, I'd like to jump in and offer a little bit of a reframe, because I think that this question cuts to the heart of something that you, Dr. Wertheimer, were speaking about earlier as well. The increasing diversity of the world in which we're living in and our Jewish communities and families places a different kind of burden on the rabbi that we've kind of been circling around but haven't named. It's not just that the conventional role of the rabbi and the demands on the rabbi's time and skills have become unbelievably burdensome, that we were saying younger generations of rabbis are pushing back against. The challenge to us today is that given the diversity of spiritual orientations and interests, which of course include those who are drawn to more halachic observance, as the last question suggested, it means that it's become just as nearly impossible for one rabbinic leader to necessarily be the leader to whom all the different personalities and visions and spiritual orientations found within their communities can necessarily relate to or build the most meaningful relationship to. The diversity of our communities requires a certain diversification of our rabbinic leadership. And what I am going to say is understandably something that requires a rethinking of the models of rabbinic leadership, but I happen to really believe that in order to build the inclusive, diverse, welcoming communities that we all continue to aspire to, we need models of rabbinic leadership that aren't necessarily concentrated in one single person, but rather models of rabbinic leadership that promote a team model, a collaborative model where communities can bring in different leaders with different skills and of their own orientations to provide opportunities for the range of sensibilities in our communities to build relationships with, experiences with, spaces with that are meaningful and inspiring in the variety of ways that people are yearning for. The idea of the one single rabbi who is leading a large congregation is not only increasingly untenable because of the lifestyle of the 25/8 expectations, but also becoming untenable because of the range of Jewish, religious, spiritual, halachic yearnings that our people have.
Thank you. I want to follow up on that with the question of what are the reasonable limits that one can demand upon rabbis? Rabbi Artson began by saying that, he and I are part of a workhorse generation, right? And I see this in the rabbis that I've coached and mentored who are younger. They want to have a little more clarity about what days they're on and off and hours, and they want to have a little bit of time to enjoy themselves. In fact, part of the way that Victor attracted me here is he said, don't worry, you'll have time to explore Ottawa and you'll have time to see the museums and cultural events. Now, of course, it's been a pretty intense time, so I'm still looking toward that. But how do we help a congregation and a rabbi to find that kind of life balance?
I was a congregational rabbi for 10 years, which I loved very, very much. And one of the reasons why it was sustainable, and I loved it for all of those 10 years, is because there was an awareness of the need for us as rabbis to be extremely present when we were present, and also that it was possible for us to go away, and that both we as rabbis and the shul would remember that we can live without each other, which was healthy for everybody. Part of why it worked really well is because, and this is part of what I think Rabbi Lewittes has been emphasizing, we were a team and we were able to spell each other. And the culture of the synagogue is that in a pastoral emergency, in the occasion of a death or a severe illness, you would absolutely get rabbinic presence. You might not be able to request which rabbi would be there in that moment, because if one of the rabbis or the cantor were on vacation or attending their, nephew's bar mitzvah, they might not come back for this moment, but we would make sure that there was somebody to hold the community in those moments. And so part of that meant we all had to have strong relationships within the community so that nobody would feel that the rabbi who was attending at that moment was a stranger to them. It meant we had to trust each other and make clear to the community that we trusted each other, so that everybody in the community knew that they were well taken care of by whomever was present. That we did have days off during the week, like many people do, and it allowed us to do things like go to museums and go to concerts and go to plays, which made our teaching richer because we were connected to what was happening in the life of the city and in the cultural reality. We made time to study, we made time to learn, and it made us able to be very, very present when we were present, and know that if we needed to be with a sick family member of our own or celebrating a simcha with someone in our own life, we were able to do that and didn't have to beg for every moment or every opportunity to do that. And I think as a result, the congregation got rabbis who worked extremely hard and were extremely present and also valued and were grateful for the time away.
That assumes a congregation can work out multiple rabbis. I just want
or
to
a rabbi and a cantor,
or a rabbi and a cantor,
or in certain cases, learned lay people who can fill in to lead Friday night services or Shabbat morning service. And in terms of what Dr. Wertheimer was saying, if part of the priority is to create a really educated community, that then creates more options, even in smaller communities that don't necessarily have multiple clergy. Sometimes it's an opportunity to create relationships with other local rabbis, so that if the rabbi of one shul is away, the rabbi of another shul has agreed to step in if there is an urgent need.
I'm going to read some of the other questions so that you can begin to pick up on which one you want to, only because time is limited.
Sorry, Rabbi Frydman-Kohl, I just want to say there are also new job sharing models from other industries that are worth looking at as we imagine the rabbinate of the future.
Yeah, there are. Look at ours that you and I are going to be sharing. So one congregant asks, how do we answer a young adult who wants to know, why do I need to belong to a synagogue to be Jewish? To some extent, Rabbi Lewittes responded to that, but others may want to comment. From another, how do we find a balance between the seniors and the youngers? Or as I used to put it, the rollers and the strollers, and finding that balance in terms of those who want more change and those who are more resistant. One person said, well, seniors are more willing to accept change and youngers don't. Another question, whether you notice differences between Canadian and American communities. And a very big concern comes up and returns to what Rabbi Cohen began with, which is a few years ago, there was a lot of concern expressed about Israel among rabbinical students and their political philosophy and orientation toward Israel. And at the same time now, there's a great concern about Israel and its ability to respond And as one person says, and how do we balance that against innocent Palestinians who may be killed? And I'm wondering if any of you want to approach those questions. Don't all jump in.
I mean, maybe to start with the end, I think what we've seen in our community in the last 18 days is an intensity of grief and awareness and presence around the crisis and tragedy in Israel, and also a variety of ways of reacting. So I think we talked a little bit before about who's leading with grief and who's leading with anger, but also, you know, for some people, very, very quickly, in addition to their grief and concern about loved ones and friends and horror at the massacre of Israelis, there was also immediately awareness and concern about the fate of innocents in Gaza. And for some people, it didn't feel like there was room right away, and maybe not even still, to have a lot of attention for that until our own dead are identified and buried. And that range is very present in our community. And we think that range is very present in the Jewish community at large, and that it's important to make room for that variety of responses and know that some people are already focused on you know, trying to express and think in deep ways about concern for civilians in Gaza, and some aren't there yet. And our students need to know that there is room within our community to hold both of those truths, and that they as rabbis are going to need to be able to serve people who are holding both of those truths. And that's part of how we have to train them, and it's part of how we have to build community. I want to say there's tremendous depth and thoughtfulness and kindness and connection, even when there are differences of opinion, and it's been beautiful to see that, and it makes me hopeful about how they'll serve as rabbis.
So as a follow-up or related to that, another congregant asked, how do we deal with the emerging reality of real anti-Semitism? We had a major conference here last week in Ottawa, drawing over 1,000 people, well planned 8 months ago for the week of the war, when we were dealing with anti-Semitism and how do we face it and how do we respond. So how do we help, or how can rabbis help congregants to deal with that as well, the reality of anti-Semitism? So now we have a lot of questions which we're not going to answer.
Well, I have something to say about the anti-Semitism. It certainly seems very live and ubiquitous. And as the guy who started a rabbinical school in Berlin, I think the response to anti-Semitism has to be careful monitoring and awareness. It has to be calling it out publicly again and again and again, not necessarily to convert the anti-Semite, although that sometimes happens, but I do think there's a general well-intended public that can be taught why certain tropes, even though repeated frequently, are toxic. I think it means reaching out to allies in the non-Jewish world who suffer from racism and sexism and homophobia and all, and pointing out the parallels in our experiences. I also think, and this is going to sound paradoxical, but there has to be a certain Jewish wokeness. Like, we have to see the prevalence of anti-Semitism. I tell my students, we live inside cages and we haven't let ourselves notice that. If you want to worship at the Wilshire Boulevard Presbyterian Church, the way you do that is you park your car in their parking lot and then you walk in, and nobody looks inside your bags. Nobody checks your car. You just do it. But I work in a place that has a single point of entrance and an armed guard at that entrance. And then I have airport security to come to work. And that's because I'm a Jew. And there should be a sense of awareness and outrage about that. That is really pathological. and intolerable. And there needs to be solidarity internally and externally. And then the final piece I'll say is that the ultimate response to anti-Semitism is to lean into the richness of our Jewish identity. Our Jewishness is not a response to anti-Semitism, and we are not held together by the fact that outsiders hate us. We happen to have one of the world's wisest and most beautiful traditions in all of its glorious diversity. And the more we lean in by learning, by study, by prayer, by a life of tikkun and mitzvot, that ultimately, if we can transmit Jewish vitality to our children and offer Jewish wisdom to our neighbors, that I think remains the primary response.
I thank you for that. We are out of time. I want to wrap up, and I want to say two things. First of all, we couldn't get to all of the questions. Secondly, we really, really appreciate the insights of our guests, our panelists. And a reminder that Kehillat Beth Israel is searching for a new rabbi. So if you know someone who would enjoy serving in a dynamic congregation in the capital of Canada, please encourage that rabbi to look at the placement list of the Rabbinical Assembly in the United Synagogue. And I'm sure that they could speak to any of you, but particularly to Rabbi Lewittes. A reminder that if there were points that came up tonight to the people who are watching that they thought were especially important, please convey that to the search committee. Our synagogue you're connected to, that might be looking for a rabbi. Again, I want to thank you all. We're going to conclude with Hatikva, and I encourage you to sing together from your home, even though you can't sing it together, the algorithm doesn't work and any of that, but it's a way that for many of us, we want to sustain and maintain our solidarity.
Kol od balevav pnima, nefesh Yehudi homia, ulfatei mizrach kadima, ayin letzion Sophia. Od lo avda tikvatenu, hatikva bat shnot alpayim, liotam chofshi be'atzenu, Eretz Tzion v'Yerushalayim. Liotam chofshi be'atzenu, Eretz Tzion v'Yerushalayim.
Thank you all for joining us. And this is recorded. At some point, we'll figure out how to share it with you, because I think that other rabbinical students may be interested in this. Thank you. Shalom.
Thank you all. Good night.
Good night. Thank you.
Good night. Thank you.